Good day everyone, I will be discussing to you the item characteristic curve, and at the end of our discussion, we'll be able to understand, analyze, and create item characteristic curve. So an observable or latent trait are variables that are easily described but it cannot be measured directly. These variables are concepts such as intelligence. So the primary goal of educational and psychological measurement is to determine how much of such a latent trait a person possesses. And there is the term generic ability na ginagamit within item response theory to refer to such latent traits. So the usual approach taken to measure an ability is mag-develop ng test na nag-consist ng number of items or ng questions. And under item response theory, the primary interest is in whether an examinee got each individual item correct or not. And the basic concept of item response theory rests upon the individual items of a test. So most tests under item response theory consist of multiple choice items and they are scored dichotomously. Correct answers is equals to 1 and the distractors or they are scored as 0. So items scored dichotomously are often referred to as binary items. Item characteristic curve can play a role in decision about which items are working well and which items are not. So ano nga ba itong item characteristic curve? So the American Psychological Association defines item characteristic curve as a plot of the probability that a test item is answered correctly against the examinee's underlying ability on the trait being measured. So the item characteristic curve is the basic building block of item response theory. And the curve is bounded between 0 and 1. It is monotonically increasing and it is commonly assumed to take the shape of a logistic function. So each item in a test has its own item characteristic curve. So here is an example of an item characteristic curve. On the x-axis, you can see the ability of the test taker, and 0 represents the mean. If it is negative, it means it is low or it is below the mean. If it is positive naman, it is high ability and it is above the mean. On the y-axis, you can see the probability of correct response that ranges from 0 to 1. That means it starts from 0, then 0.1, 0.2, up to 1. So in the example, as an example of item characteristic curve, you can see there it is monotonically increasing. It means that it is not decreasing. If it is decreasing, you should omit the item. And also, it follows the shape of a logistic function. Logistic function, it means it is a shape. An item characteristic curve is it is a graphical representation ng dalawang technical properties, which is the item difficulty and the item discrimination, which has been discussed earlier. So as we have discussed earlier nga, item difficulty is obtained by calculating the proportion of the total number of test takers who answered the item correctly, while item discrimination naman is na-obtain siya sa pag-measure ng difference between the proportion of high scorers answering an item correctly and the portion of low scorers answering the item correctly. So the steeper the curve, the better the item can discriminate. The flatter the curve, the less the item is able to discriminate, since the probability of correct response at low ability levels is nearly the same as it is at high ability levels. So the higher the P or the difficulty of an item, the easier the item, and the higher the value of D or the discrimination of the item, the greater the number of high scorers answering the item correctly. So as you can see in figure 1, there are 3 item characteristic curves. So these item characteristic curves has the same discrimination pero may iba-iba silang level of difficulty. So the left-hand curve, yung sa pinakataas, represents an easy item. Bakit? Because the probability of correct response is high for low ability examinees and approaches 1 for high ability examinees. So the center curve naman Sa gitna, nag-represent siya ng item of medium difficulty because the probability of correct response is low at the highest ability level, around 0.5 in the middle of the ability scale, and near 1 at the highest ability levels. At itong right-hand curve naman, yung sa pinakailalim, it represents a hard item bucket because the probability of correct response is low for most of the ability scale and increases only when the higher ability levels are reached. Even at the highest level shown na nakita nyo dyan sa positive 3 na ability, the probability of correct response is only 0.8 for most of the difficult item. Ito naman tayo sa figure 2. So, ang figure 2 ay nagpapakita na tatlong item characteristic curve na may the same level of difficulty pero iba-iba sila ng level of discrimination. So, the upper curve has a high level of discrimination since the curve is quite steep in the middle, where the probability of correct response changes very rapidly as ability increases. So just a short distance to the left of the middle of the curve, the probability of correct response is much less than 0.5. And a short distance to the right, the probability is much greater than 0.5. So dito naman tayo sa middle curve. The middle curve represents an item with a moderate level of discrimination. Bakit? Because the slope of this curve is much less than the previous curve and the probability of correct response changes less dramatically than the previous curve as the ability level increases. However, the probability of correct response is near 0 for the lowest ability examinees and near 1 for the highest ability examinees. The third curve naman represents an item with low discrimination. Bakit? Because the curve has a very small slope and the probability of correct response nag-change slowly over the full range of abilities shown. Thus, all item characteristic curves of the type used here actually becomes asymptotic to a probability of 0 at one tail and to 1.0 at the other tail. So, the restricted range employed in the figures is necessary lang siya to fit the curves on the computer screen kapag i-input mo na yung data mo sa computer, sa mga computer applications. So, at figure 3 naman, it is a special case that is of interest, namely that of an item with perfect discrimination. So, the item characteristic curve of such an item is a vertical line at some point along the ability scale. In the figure, as you can show in the figure. So, to the left of the vertical line at 1.5, the probability of correct response is 0. To the right of the line naman, the probability of correct response is 1. Thus, the item discriminates perfectly between examinees whose abilities are above and below an ability score of 1.5. Such items would be ideal for distinguishing between examinees with abilities just above and below 1.5. However, such an item makes no distinction among those items na with abilities above 1.5 nor among those examinees with abilities below 1.5. An item may also vary in terms of its difficulty level. An easy item will shift the item characteristic curve to the left along the ability axis, indicating that many people will likely to get the item correct. A difficult item will shift the ICC naman to the right along the horizontal axis, indicating that fewer people will answer the item correctly. In other words, it takes high ability levels for a person to have a high probability of the response being scored as correct. So there are applications that you can use to make or to draw a item characteristic curve. For example, as I have searched through online, there are the applications such as the Desmos. You can search it through online, IRT Desmos, and then you will input there the datas you have na nandyan sa inyo, and then the app will just plot the item characteristic curve. Then we also have the the stata and the SPSS. So in stata and SPSS, you will first choose if it is a 1P, 2P, or 3P model of IRT. So later we'll discuss that models. So as for now, let us evaluate if you have understand item characteristic curve. So item A, is it a good item or not? So item A is not a good item because the probability of test takers responding correctly is high for test takers of low ability and low for test takers of high ability. So item B na naman tayo. Is it a good item, test item, or not? So the curve or the item B is not a good test item because the curve tells us that the test takers of moderate ability have the highest probability of answering this item correctly. Test takers with the greatest amount of ability, as well as their counterparts at the other end of the ability spectrum, are unlikely to respond correctly to this item. So item B may be one of those items to which people who know too much or think too much are likely to respond incorrectly. Let us have item C. Is it a good item or not? So item C is a good test item because the probability of responding correctly to the test item, it increases with ability. Lastly, we have item D. So item D's ICC profile. Item D profiles an item that discriminates at only one point on the continuum of ability. The probability is great that all test takers at or above this point will respond correctly to the item. And the probability of an incorrect response is great for test takers who fall below that particular point in ability. So an item such as item D, therefore, has excellent discriminative ability and would be useful in a test design. For example, to select applicants on the basis of some cutoff score. However, yung item na katulad nito might not be desirable in a test design to provide detailed information on test takers' ability across all ability levels. So now let us discuss the IRT models. So first we have the 1P or the B parameter IRT model, or it is the difficulty parameter or threshold parameter. So this parameter measures difficulty or threshold only. So B parameter tells us how difficult or easy an item is. Next, we have the 2P or the A parameter or the discrimination parameter. So 2P IRT model or the A parameter tells us how effectively an item can discriminate between highly proficient students and less proficient students. Moreover, it uses both A and B parameters. And lastly, we have the 3P or the C parameter. So the 3P IRT model or the C parameter deals with the G parameter or the guessing parameter. So this parameter tells us how likely the examinees are to obtain the correct answer by guessing. It uses the A, the B, and the G parameters. If most items have higher origin on the y-axis or the y-intercept, it means that it is when x becomes 0. So this means that the correct answers were probably obtained through guessing. So again, if you want to plot item characteristic curves, there are applications that are available, again, such as the Desmos, the Stata, and the SPSS. That's all, and thank you for listening.